7:45 in the morning, September 19th, 1944. A low ridge in eastern France that the maps called Hill 246. First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper could not see his own hand in front of his face. The fog had come in before the sun. It had rolled off the low ground east of Arracourt in the small hours of that morning, slow and heavy, filling every ditch and hollow across the Lorraine plain. By 6, a man standing in an open field could not see the tree line at its edge. By 7, he could not see the man beside him. The rain had been falling for 3 days. Now the sky itself seemed to have come down to the ground. What Leiper did not know is that in less than 1 hour, one of his sergeants, a man named Henry Hartmann, from a small town in Pennsylvania, was going to do something in a vehicle the Germans called a toy. Something so improbable that 80 years later, historians are still arguing about how it happened. This is the story of the Purple Heart Box, and of the men who made it, for one morning in the fog of eastern France, the deadliest killer in the United States Army. If your father served in an armored unit in Europe, this story is about the men he fought beside. If your uncle came home from France in 1945 and never talked about it, this may be one of the reasons why. Lorraine in September looks like nowhere else in France. The land rolls in long, slow swells, cut by shallow streams and stone hedgerows and stands of oak that have stood on the same ground since Napoleon marched past them. Cut by shallow streams and stone hedgerows and stands of oak that have stood on the same ground since Napoleon marched past them. The villages are built low, slate roofs, yellow stone walls. Farmyards with the manure heap out front the way it was in 1800 and 1890. It is the country that Frenchmen had been fighting over with Germans for as long as either country had existed. Every generation had left its dead in the same fields. The old men in those villages remembered Verdun. Their fathers had remembered Sedan. Their grandfathers had remembered 1970. And now, on the wet ground east of Arracourt, in a fog so dense that men could hear the water dripping from the barrels of their own guns, another generation had come. On the reverse slope of the ridge that morning, roughly 800 yards southeast of a stone village called Rechicourt-la-Petite, 4 American vehicles sat with their engines idling. They were low, they were open-topped, they were painted olive drab, streaked with rain. The men inside could not see the vehicle behind them or the vehicle in front of them. They could only hear engines breathing, the tick of hot metal cooling in cold air, the soft click of a radio squelch. Somewhere at the edge of hearing, the far-off crump of an artillery round landing on wet ground, Edwin Leiper, in the lead vehicle, was watching a wall of white nothing, and he was listening. Somewhere below him, hidden in that same fog, tanks were coming. He did not know how many. He did not know how far. He knew only that they were German, and that the 4 vehicles under his command had been sent here to stop them. Each of those vehicles weighed 17 tons. Each carried a 76mm gun. Each was wrapped in armor so thin that a heavy machine gun round, fired close enough, could punch straight through it. 13 millimeters on the hull, half an inch, less than the thickness of a man's little finger. The turret above Leiper's head had no roof at all. Rain dripped onto his map case, onto the radio, onto the empty brass casings rolling under his boots. This was the M18 Hellcat, the fastest tracked vehicle of the entire Second World War. 55 miles an hour on a good road, and right now, on this ridge, in this fog, it was crawling at walking pace toward a fight it should not, by any reasonable measure, be able to win. Before we go any further, you need to understand 3 things. You need to understand how an American army that had run 400 miles in 5 weeks ended up sitting still on a piece of French farmland. You need to understand what the machine under Leiper's feet actually was, and why the men who crewed it did not use its official name. And you need to understand who was coming up that road out of the fog, and why he did not know he was coming alone. Start with the Army. By the beginning of August, 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army had done something no Allied force in Europe had done before. From the breakout at Avranches on the 1st of August, it had swept south, east, and northeast in a mechanized offensive of a scale that had no precedent in Western warfare. Le Mans, Orléans, Chartres, Troyes, Reims, Verdun. In 53 days, elements of the Third Army covered 400 miles, the lead formation of that army. The sword tip of the whole thing was Major General John S. Wood's 4th Armored Division. Wood's division did not move like other American divisions moved. It did not stop at nightfall. It did not wait for its supply lines to catch up. It did not ask for permission to keep going. It moved and moved and moved, and the map behind it was cluttered with signs of a war that had gone past too fast for the Germans to close the gaps. By the second week of September, the 4th Armored was so far ahead of every other Allied unit that its supply trucks needed 2 full days just to reach the nearest fuel depot and return. And then the gas ran out, not gradually, not partially. 3rd Army's daily fuel allocation collapsed from 400,000 gallons to 31,000, enough to move a single division. Not an army. Here is the first thing most people do not know about Arracourt. The reason Patton stopped was not the German army. It was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, 400 miles to the north, launching Operation Market Garden. Every available gallon of fuel in the Allied logistical network was being funneled toward the airborne drops in Holland. The C-47s carrying paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 1st Airborne Division needed avgas. The armored column of the British 30 Corps needed diesel. The men and machines that would jump onto the bridges at Nijmegen and Arnhem needed everything that a modern army needs to fight, and there was not enough of it to go around. Patton, in his diary, called the fuel decision the worst mistake of the war. He was not a modest man about his own opinions, but on this one he had a case. His army was 30 miles from the German border when the trucks stopped. His tanks sat where they had stopped in the rolling farmland around Arracourt and waited for gasoline that would not come. Colonel Bruce C. Clark, commanding Combat Command A of the 4th Armored, set up a defensive perimeter. He had Shermans. He had Stuarts. He had 36 Hellcats of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion attached to him. And he had a lieutenant colonel named Creighton W. Abrams, 30 years old that week, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion from a Sherman he had named Thunderbolt. Abrams was already on his 4th Thunderbolt by September. The previous 3 had been shot out from under him. They dug in. They waited. The men slept in their tanks. They cleaned their weapons in the rain. They ate cold rations because a heating fire in the open drew German artillery. And they wrote letters home on the backs of ration boxes, and they watched the tree line to the east where they knew, without being told, that something was coming. Now understand the machine. The M18 was not born from optimism. It was born from panic, ruined 4 years. The summer of 1940. The world watching the newsreels in disbelief as the German army, which most military professionals had considered no more dangerous than the army it had been in 1918, crushed the French army in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The French had the best tanks in the world on paper. The Char B-1 bis outweighed and outgunned anything in the German inventory, and it did not matter. The Germans moved faster. The Germans concentrated. The Germans used their tanks as an offensive weapon, while the French used theirs as mobile pillboxes for the infantry to lean on. Every general in the American army watched that campaign and understood the same thing. If the German panzers ever got their hands on the American continent, the current American army would not be able to stop them. The army did not have modern tanks. It did not have modern doctrine. It did not have modern anti-tank guns. What it had was a memory of Below Wood and a peacetime budget that Congress had spent the 1930s trying to shrink. In the summer of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, a colonel named Andrew D. Bruce, soon to be promoted to brigadier general, was given a mission that sounded almost philosophical: design a vehicle that could kill tanks. Not fight them, kill them, and do it with something other than armor. Bruce was an Illinois-born officer who had made his career in the regular army. A West Point graduate, class of 1916. He had served in the First World War as a young infantry officer. He had spent the interwar years watching, reading, thinking. He believed something most tank officers of his generation refused to believe. He believed speed was armor. He believed a vehicle fast enough to avoid being hit did not need steel to stop a shell that never arrived. He wanted a gun that could kill at long range. He wanted a machine that could disengage before the enemy could react. He wanted, in effect, a hunter, not a soldier. He wanted an American army version of what the Germans had used against the French in 1940. Aggressive, mobile, concentrated, willing to move faster than the enemy could think, Buick built it. The Buick Motor Division of General Motors. in a factory in Flint, Michigan that had been stamping out automobiles a year earlier. They gave it an automatic transmission, one of the first ever fitted to a military vehicle. A driver in a Sherman had to double-clutch through 5 forward gears in a manual box. A driver in an M18 pushed a lever and let the transmission do the work. In the middle of a firefight, that difference could be a man's life. They gave it an air-cooled radial aircraft engine, the Continental R975, adapted from the same power plant that had turned biplane propellers a decade before. They gave it a torsion bar suspension that let the crew ride over broken ground faster than any Sherman could dream of. They stripped the weight down until the vehicle could barely be called armored at all, half an inch on the hull, no roof on the turret. A 76mm gun that, at close range, could kill a Panzer IV without difficulty, and at any range at all, could not reliably penetrate the front of a Panther. The crews looked at the specifications, and they gave the machine names. Some names came from infantrymen who had watched Hellcats burn. Some came from Sherman crews who refused to trade seats. The names were not kind. But the ones that stuck, the one the crews themselves used in letters home and in quiet conversations behind the lines, was the simplest one. They called it the Purple Heart Box. The Purple Heart is the medal you get for being wounded or killed in combat. The Purple Heart Box was the vehicle that got you the medal. It was a bitter joke, but every man in the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion understood exactly what it meant. Here is the second thing most people do not know about Arracourt. By the summer of 1944, when the first M18 battalions came ashore in Normandy, some senior American commanders were actively trying to shut the program down. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's staff at 1st Army Headquarters looked at the armor. They looked at the gun's performance against the front of a Panther, and they concluded that sending men into battle in this vehicle was, at best, optimistic. At worst, it was manslaughter. The critics were not wrong on the math. In a face-to-face duel with a Panther at any range, the M18 had every disadvantage. Its gun could not penetrate what the Panther's front plate could easily absorb. Its armor could not stop what the Panther's gun could easily send. A straight fight was a Hellcat funeral. Bradley's staff wanted the whole force reorganized. They wanted the Hellcats replaced with heavier vehicles. They wanted General Bruce's doctrine reconsidered. There was a serious effort inside 1st Army in the summer of 1944 to end the tank destroyer experiment before more crews died in it. The men in the Purple Heart boxes did not know that, or if they knew, they did not have the luxury of caring. There was a war going on. There were Panthers in the tree lines. There were mothers back home in Iowa and Alabama and Oregon who did not want telegrams. The men learned to fight the vehicle they had. They learned it fast, and the ones who did not learn fast enough did not come home. That was the machine. Now understand the men. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had come ashore in Normandy in late July of 1944. By September, they had been fighting continuously for almost 2 months. 3 companies, 36 Hellcats, about 800 men. They had fought their way out of the hedgerows of Cotentin. They had crossed the Cotentin Peninsula behind the 4th Armored Division. They had rolled south into Brittany, then wheeled east across France in the great pursuit that had ended for lack of gas at the Moselle. They had fought at Coutances. They had fought at Avranches. They had fought at Lorraine. They had fought in a dozen small, nameless engagements at road junctions and river crossings and villages that the men would remember by the number of dead friends and not by the name. Company C was commanded by Captain Thomas J. Evans. His 3rd platoon was led by 1st Lieutenant Edwin Leiper. Leiper had 4 vehicles under him and 20 men. His lead tank was commanded by a sergeant named Stacy. His last tank, the 4th in line, was commanded by a sergeant whose name has survived in the records for a reason we will come to. His name was Henry R. Hartman. None of these men were ordinary tank crewmen. They could not afford to be. In a Sherman, a mistake could cost you a track. In a Hellcat, a mistake cost you 5 men. The machine did not forgive. And the crews who had survived from Normandy to Lorraine, 3 months of continuous combat in an open-topped vehicle with no armor worth the name, were not the men who had started that summer. They were what remained after the machine had done its own selection. 90 days in the same box. 90 days sleeping in it, cursing in it, eating cold rations in it, watching each other's backs in it. 90 days of learning each other's voices on the radio the way you learn the voice of a brother in a dark room. 90 days of learning that the gunner would fire before the commander finished the sentence, because the commander did not need to finish the sentence, because they had done this 100 times together. 90 days of learning that the driver would reverse without being told, because the driver had watched the muzzle flash of the last round and already knew. Hold that number, because on the other side of the fog that morning, another number was moving toward them. 2 weeks. Now, understand the Germans. 15 days earlier, on the 4th of September, in a training area called Wildflecken in eastern Germany, a new formation had been activated. The 113th Panzer Brigade. Its commander was Oberst Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf, 47 years old, a Prussian aristocrat. A career cavalryman who had won the Iron Cross Second Class and First Class in the trenches of the First World War. He had led a rifle regiment on the Eastern Front in the opening summer of Barbarossa. He had fought outside Leningrad. He had been promoted to full colonel in 1942. He had trained panzer replacements at Magdeburg. In late summer of 1944, he had been handed a brigade and told to make it ready for combat as fast as human effort would allow. He had been a soldier all his adult life. He had a wife, Anna Matilde, whom he had married on the 2nd of December 1914, when both were young enough to believe the war would end that Christmas. That war had ended, eventually. He had come home. He had raised his children. He had gone to another war. He had gone to a third. And now, in the autumn of the Third War, in a country whose leaders were making decisions that the professional soldiers no longer believed in, he had been given a factory-fresh weapon and told to hold Nancy. On paper, what he was given was a fist, 2 battalions of Panther tanks, 2 battalions, 42 Panthers, factory-fresh Ausführung G models, straight off the assembly lines at MAN and Daimler-Benz, some still wearing transport grease on their glacis plates. Enough men and machines to fill a road column stretching over a mile. But here is the third thing most people do not know about Arracourt. According to the German records themselves, the 113th Panzer Brigade was missing almost everything that had ever made a German panzer division dangerous. It had no reconnaissance battalion. It had no dedicated artillery. It had no engineer troops. The German High Command had, in the words of one post-war analyst, forgotten every lesson they had learned about combined arms warfare and had gambled instead on the raw superiority of their tanks. The generals who had once written the textbook on how tanks, infantry, artillery, engineers, and reconnaissance had to move together as one organism had, in the 5th year of the war, thrown that textbook away. They had done this because Adolf Hitler ordered them to. 4 days after the July 20th assassination attempt, on the 24th of July 1944, the Führer had personally directed the creation of a new type of formation, smaller than a division, faster to raise, concentrated on tanks alone. The theory was that a Panzer Brigade could be assembled in weeks rather than months and thrown into combat before the Allies could react. The theory failed to account for what a Panzer Brigade would face when it got there. The men inside those Panthers were the second problem. Most of them had never fought together. Some had never fought at all. They had been pulled from replacement depots, given abbreviated training, loaded onto trains, and shipped west under cover of darkness because Allied aircraft ruled the daylight sky. They had 2 weeks to learn each other's names. 2 weeks. The gunners had 2 weeks to learn the peculiarities of the Ausführung G's new gun sight. The drivers had 2 weeks to learn the peculiarities of a 50-ton tank that pulled hard to one side on wet ground and drank fuel at a rate that would empty its tanks in less than 100 miles. The loaders had 2 weeks to learn to feed a 75mm, round 89 centimeters long, into a breech at the far corner of a cramped turret without dropping it, without jamming it, without slowing the gunner down. The commanders had 2 weeks to learn to trust the 4 other men in their turret, and the 4 other men had 2 weeks to learn to trust them back. 2 weeks. That was the man coming up the road toward Leiper's 4 Hellcats. Not the myth of the Panther, not the Panzer General of the Blitzkrieg years. A veteran officer given a factory-fresh weapon and a crew of strangers, and told to break through. He was not the only one moving. 18th Manteuffel was small, aggressive, 47 years old, 5 feet, 2 inches tall, a former cavalryman like Seckendorf. He had made his reputation on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. He had commanded panzer divisions on the retreat from Moscow. He had led the 7th Panzer Division. He had led the Grossdeutschland Division. He was a man who understood, better than most in the Reich by that autumn, what a tank formation could and could not do. Manteuffel had inherited the 5th Panzer Army only weeks before. He knew his formations were not ready. He said so in writing to his superiors. He was told to attack anyway. His plan for Arracourt was a classic pincer. The 111th Panzer Brigade would strike from the south. The 113th would strike from the east, hammer and anvil. Between them, they would crush the 4th Armored Division and reopen the road to Nancy. Here is what the plan required. It required both brigades to arrive at the same place, at the same time, in coordination. That is not what happened. 9 o'clock at night, the 18th of September. On the American side of the line, near a village called Leze, 1st Lieutenant Wilbur J. Berard, commanding the 2nd Platoon of Charlie Company, 37th Tank Battalion, sensed something wrong. He was standing outside his Sherman in the dark, and one of his soldiers, Staff Sergeant Timothy J. Dunn, had come up to report. Dunn had been listening, not looking, listening. Southeast of their position, out beyond the tree line, out where the map showed only empty French farmland, he could hear something. Engines, the gurgling, humming, low-frequency thrum of German Panzer engines idling somewhere they should not be. A Maybach HL 230 makes a very particular sound when it is running under load in low gear. Once you have heard it, you do not mistake it for anything else. Dunn had heard it. He was a staff sergeant, not a lieutenant, but he had been in the war long enough to know that a report of engines at 9 o'clock at night, southeast of an American perimeter, in country supposedly held by no organized German force of consequence, was worth waking the chain of command over. Berard did not dismiss it. He put it on the wire. That report went up the chain that night. It reached Colonel Clark's command post in Arracourt. Clark read it. Clark was already suspicious. He had been reading enemy intercepts for days. He had been listening to the same reports of engines and half-track movements and unaccounted German fuel dumps that any competent commander was hearing that autumn. He did not know what he was facing yet, but he had begun to suspect that whatever was coming was going to come with tanks. And on the other side of the fog, at the same hour, in the dark forests of Paroy, about 12 miles from where Berard's man was listening, the 111th Panzer Brigade was losing itself. The night was moonless. The roads through the woods were narrow, unmarked, unfamiliar. Whole companies of Panthers wandered off route. Radio contact broke down. Drivers who had never trained on French roads at night mistook logging tracks for main roads and led their tanks deeper into terrain nobody had reconnoitered. Somewhere in the darkness, an entire Panzer battalion was rolling in a slow circle through pine woods, where a horse cart would have had trouble turning around. When dawn came on the 19th, one entire half of the German pincer was not where it was supposed to be. Here is the fourth thing most people do not know about Arracourt. Colonel Erich von Seckendorf did not know this. He did not know his brother brigade was lost in the trees. He did not know his flank was open. He did not know the coordination on which his whole attack depended had collapsed in the darkness 12 miles away from him. He led his 42 Panthers out of their assembly area in the pre-dawn dark, into the thickening fog, believing his brother brigade was moving alongside him a few miles to the south. He was, in the most literal sense, attacking alone. He would not learn otherwise until the fight was already lost. And this is the strange, cold arithmetic that no comparison chart can capture. A Panther outweighed a Hellcat by 28 tons. Its frontal armor was 6 times thicker. Its long-barreled 75mm gun could kill a Sherman at 2,000 yards. But a chart cannot measure the distance between a crew that has bled together for 90 days and a crew that met each other on a train platform 2 weeks ago. A chart cannot measure a brigade that got lost in the woods. A chart cannot measure fog so thick that a gun designed to kill at 2,000 yards has no target at 30. At 7:45 on the morning of the 19th of September, none of the men on Hill 246 knew any of this. Leiper knew only what he could hear. He heard engines. He heard the grinding of tracks somewhere down the slope. He heard rain on his own hull. He heard his own breathing and the breathing of his gunner beside him, and the water dripping off the rim of the open turret onto the seat behind him. He heard from very far away the low double thump of an American artillery piece registering a new grid, and the answering pop of a German mortar somewhere to the northeast. Then, 30 feet in front of him, he saw a shape emerge from the white wall of fog. A gun barrel, the muzzle brake of a German tank gun. Rising out of the mist the way something rises out of deep water, he had less than 3 seconds to decide what to do. 3 seconds. That was the margin. To understand how those 4 Hellcats got to that ridge, you have to go back 45 minutes. Before Leiper ever saw that muzzle brake in the fog, another man had already seen the whole column, 7 o'clock in the morning. A jeep on a wet farm road east of Arracourt. Captain William A. Dwight, liaison officer between Combat Command A and the 37th Tank Battalion, was driving between the 2 command posts on routine business when he heard something that did not belong in a rear area. Diesel. Heavy diesel. The specific rumble that a column of armored vehicles makes when it is moving in file at low gear. He slowed the jeep. He looked out across the fields toward the village of Moncourt. And there, through a thin place in the fog, he saw them, Panthers, in column. Moving up the road, he did not stop to count. He did not stop to identify them. He turned the jeep around and drove straight back to Combat Command A headquarters. He walked in and told Colonel Bruce C. Clark what he had seen. Clark was a big man, broad shoulders, a West Point graduate, 43 years old that autumn. He had been in the Army since the First World War. He was not a man who wasted motion. He listened to Dwight. He looked at the map on his wall, and he understood, in the space of a single breath, exactly what was happening. The Germans were not probing his line. They were coming for his throat. He walked, not ran, out of the headquarters, down the wet road toward the staging area where Charlie Company of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had bedded down for the night. Captain Thomas J. Evans was shaving beside his tank when Clark found him. A German artillery shell came down at that exact moment between Evans's Hellcat and the one parked next to it. It plowed up the wet earth. It threw mud across Evans's face and shirt. It did not detonate the way it should have. Evans stood there with a razor in one hand, half his jaw still lathered, and looked at the crater. Clark did not raise his voice. Get them into position. Now, Evans had 1 platoon he could put on the road inside of 5 minutes. His 3rd platoon. Under 1st Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, 4 Hellcats, 20 men. He gave the order. Captain Dwight climbed back into his jeep and drove ahead of them, up the muddy track toward the ridge the maps called Hill 246, 800 yards southeast of the stone village of Rechicourt-la-Petite. The 4 Hellcats followed him, engines throttled down against the mist, headlights off, crews standing in their open turrets, watching the fog for the first sign of what was underneath it. 7:45 in the morning, Leiper's platoon crested the ridge. Dwight pointed. Leiper deployed. The Hellcats spread across the reverse slope, hulls just below the crest, gun barrels leveled toward the east. The drivers cut their engines to a low idle. The commanders leaned out over their open turret rings, and then, 30 feet in front of Leiper's lead vehicle, the fog moved. A shape came out of it, the long, tapered muzzle brake of a 75mm German tank gun, rising out of the mist. Close enough that if the wind had shifted by another dozen paces, the German commander in the turret behind that gun would already have been staring straight into Leiper's face. Sergeant Stacy, in the lead Hellcat, saw it in the same instant. He did not give an order. There was no time for an order. His gunner already had the traverse wheel in his hand. The turret swung. The gun found the shape in the fog. The 76mm cannon fired. The muzzle flash lit the fog from the inside like a lantern. The round crossed 30 feet of wet air in a fraction of a second. It struck the front plate of the Panther, and the Panther stopped moving. Not a fireball. Not yet, just a hard metallic hammer strike. A jolt through 45 tons of steel, and something inside that German tank died. The driver, the transmission, both. The engine idled on. The vehicle sat there like a killed animal that had not yet been told. Behind it, another turret was rising out of the fog. Stacy's loader was already ramming the next round into the breach. His gunner adjusted the traverse. The second shot came less than 15 seconds after the first. It hit the second Panther, and it stopped that one too. 2 German tanks in less than half a minute, and then the third Panther in the German column found Stacy. The round that came back through the fog was not a warning. It was a hammer. It struck Stacy's Hellcat low on the hull. The impact walked through the crew compartment in a way that only men who have been inside an armored vehicle when it is hit can truly understand. It comes through the soles of your boots first, then through your knees, then through your teeth. The turret went out of alignment. 2 of the 5 men inside were wounded. The engine kept running. The driver, half deaf, working on instinct, threw the transmission into reverse and pulled off the ridge. Stacy would live. His crew would live. His Hellcat would be repaired. He did not know any of that yet. He knew only that his driver had gotten him out. The second Hellcat in the line, the one behind Stacy, caught the Panther that had killed Stacy's gun. A single 76mm round into the flank at close range. The German tank shuddered and went silent. 2 more Panthers further back in the column tried to reverse into the tree line. They did not make it. The Hellcats caught them turning, and in the second that a Panther takes to complete a turn, its side armor is exposed. 40mm of vertical steel where the front plate has 80. The 76mm guns punched into that thinner sidearm before the German drivers could complete the maneuver. 5 German tanks destroyed, 1 Hellcat damaged and withdrawn, Eppel time. Less than 5 minutes. Hold that number for a moment. 15 days to build the 113th Panzer Brigade. 15 days to pull the crews from replacement depots, to load the Panthers onto trains, to move them west under cover of darkness, to assemble them on the training ground at Wildflecken. 5 minutes for 4 American vehicles with half an inch of armor to erase 5 of those Panthers from the war. Leiper stood in his open turret, and the fog around him smelled of cordite and burning diesel now. And the ridge in front of him held 2 dead Panthers, and the reverse slope behind him held 1 damaged Hellcat crawling back toward friendly lines. He had 3 vehicles left. He had done what he had been sent to do. He had blocked the road. He had killed 5 Panthers. Every instinct that any commander wearing 13mm of armor should have was telling him to pull out, to fall back, to put distance between his surviving crews and whatever was still coming up that road. He did not pull out. He repositioned. He moved his 3 surviving Hellcats to a slight depression on the neighboring high ground. A piece of dead ground that masked their hulls from anyone approaching along the road from the south. He put his gunners back on their sights. He got on the radio. His 3 surviving tank commanders did not have to ask him to repeat himself. They already knew what he was going to say. That is the 5th thing most people do not know about Arracourt. The advantage the Americans had that morning was not made of steel. It was not the 76mm gun. It was not the automatic transmission. It was not the Continental radial engine. The advantage was invisible. The advantage was a doctrine that most armies in history have never had. In the American Army of 1944, a colonel trusted a captain trusted a lieutenant trusted a sergeant, and every one of those men, all the way down the chain, was allowed to look at the situation in front of him and make his own decision without asking permission from the man above him. Bruce Clark did not tell Evans exactly where to put his tank destroyers. He told him to get them into position. Evans did not tell Leiper exactly how to fight on the ridge. He gave him the ridge. Leiper did not tell Stacy when to fire. He gave him a sector. The men below made the decisions, and when Leiper decided on his own authority, in the space of 1 breath, not to withdraw but to reposition, no one above him second-guessed him. The system was built to let him make that choice. The Germans did not have that. The German Army of 1944 still had, on paper, one of the finest tactical doctrines in the world. Auftragstaktik, the mission-type order, was a German invention. It was the concept the Americans were now using. But by the 5th year of the war, in a brigade thrown together in 15 days, in a fog thicker than any of them had ever fought in, the Panther crews on that road below, Hill 246, were not doing Auftragstaktik. They were reading maps and looking for orders that were not coming, because the men who could have given those orders were in tanks a mile behind them, or lost in the trees at Paroy, or dead already on the top of the ridge. The Americans had 90 days. The Germans had 2 weeks. 90 days of shared combat, translated into the twitch of a hand on a traverse wheel. The half-second decision of a driver. The calm voice of a lieutenant on the radio. That is the invisible weight on the American side of the scale. And now the second wave was coming. Leiper, in his new position, straining forward in his open turret, caught the outline of a turret moving along the road below the ridge. Then another. then another. The main column of the 113th Panzer Brigade was pushing up the Metz to Strasbourg Road in march formation. They still did not know what had happened to their lead element. They still believed they were moving through a rear area. They still believed the pincer plan was working. They still believed that somewhere to the south, the 111th Panzer Brigade was moving parallel to them, closing the trap. They were wrong about all of it. Somewhere in the German column, a young panzer commander stood in his turret and squinted into the fog and thought about the letter he had written the night before to a girl in Bremen. He would not finish thinking that thought. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a slaughter of the Americans. In clear weather, at open range, a column of Panthers moving on a road has the advantage over anyone. That 75mm gun in the Panther turret, the KWK-42L/70, could reach out to 2,000 yards and kill a Sherman before the Sherman even knew it was being hunted. But this was not clear weather. At 100 yards, in fog, the rules of armored combat change completely. The Panther cannot use its range advantage. Its crew cannot spot, range, and fire before a faster vehicle reacts. Its optics, some of the finest in the world, are staring into a wall of white. The commander in the turret is straining his eyes and hearing his own heartbeat in his ears. At 100 yards, in fog, the engagement becomes a knife fight. And in a knife fight, the thing that matters most is not how much armor you carry. It is how fast you move. It is how quickly you fire. It is who sees whom first. Leiper's 3 Hellcats opened fire from the flank. The first rounds caught the German column driving in file. Panthers that had been rolling down the road, believing themselves to be in safe country, suddenly found high-velocity shells slamming into their thinner side armor. 40mm on the hull, 60 on the turret sides. The 76mm APCBC round could penetrate cleanly at that distance. Cleanly. The lead Panthers stopped. Some tried to traverse their turrets toward the ridge. Others tried to reverse. The fog made coordination impossible. The Panther commanders could hear gunfire, but could not see where it was coming from, and every vehicle that turned to face one Hellcat exposed its flank to another. The Germans hit back. A 75mm round out of the fog struck one of Leiper's Hellcats. It killed it. The round went through the thin hull plate as if it were paper. The crew that survived bailed out of the open turret and dragged their wounded down the reverse slope on foot, disappearing into the mist toward friendly lines. Minutes later, a second Hellcat was hit. Another crew went over the side. That left one, Sergeant Henry R. Hartman's Hellcat, the last vehicle in the line. The fourth of the 4 that had come up the ridge less than an hour earlier, still in the depression on the neighboring ridge, still firing. What Hartman did over the next several minutes is difficult to reconstruct with perfect precision because the fog that saved his life also swallowed the details of the fight. But the after-action report of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion confirms the result. From that single vehicle, 17 tons, half an inch of armor, an open turret filling with rain, Sergeant Henry R. Hartman destroyed 6 German tanks. 6 think for a moment about what that requires. Each shot means breaking cover. Each shot means that the muzzle flash of the 76mm gun marks Hartman's exact position in the fog like a signal flare. Each shot means every surviving Panther crew now knows exactly where he is, and each shot means his driver has to move, reverse, reposition, find new cover, stop, let the gunner reacquire a target, fire again, then move again, in a vehicle with no roof, in a vehicle with no meaningful armor. In a vehicle with a gun that, according to every technical manual printed in the United States that year, was not supposed to be able to kill a Panther from the front at all. Which brings us to the 6th thing most people do not know about Arracourt. The American 76mm gun on the M18 had been designed with a special round to solve the Panther problem. A tungsten core cartridge designated HEAP, high-velocity armor piercing. Fired at close range with tungsten in its heart, HVAP could theoretically punch through the front glacis of a Panther and kill the crew inside. On paper, in practice, in September of 1944, in Lorraine, HVAP barely existed at the front. Production was limited. Tungsten was needed for machine tool bits and factory cutters back home. American industry had spent the first years of the war building the tools to build the weapons, and tungsten was rare enough that the Army had to choose between using it in shells and using it in the lathes and drills that made the shells possible. Distribution was slower than production. What HVAP existed at the front was rationed to a handful of rounds per Hellcat, and only sometimes. Most Hellcats went into battle carrying standard armor-piercing rounds that, by the specifications, could not penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range, which means Hartmann was doing what his technical manual said he could not do. He was killing Panthers with the wrong ammunition. He was doing it because he was not shooting at the front. He was shooting at the flank, at the rear, at the thinner side armor where the 76mm shell did not need tungsten to do its work. 40 to 50 millimeters of vertical steel on the Panther hull. The APCBC round of ordinary hardened steel could go through that at anything under 300 yards. Hartmann was firing at ranges between 100 and 275 yards. His gunner had learned that. His driver had learned that. His loader had learned that. They had learned it in Normandy, in Brittany, in the long summer campaign across France, watching other crews try and fail. They had learned it by watching what happened to the men who tried to trade shots frontally with a Panther. Those men were not in the 704th anymore. They were memorials on a wall back at battalion. 6 times Hartmann did this. 6 times he broke cover. 6 times he fired. 6 times his driver got him out before the German turrets could swing to where the muzzle flash had been. There is no way to reconstruct what Hartmann was thinking during those 6 shots. Nobody who was in the turret with him ever left a written account. He himself never spoke publicly about it in any interview that has survived. He was a sergeant from Pennsylvania. He was not a man who wrote memoirs. He came home from the war, went back to his life, and the story of what he had done that morning was pieced together decades later by historians reading the paperwork that the 704th had filed at the end of the day. But we can guess at some of it. We can guess that at some point during those 6 shots, Hartmann knew that he was the last vehicle of his platoon still in the fight. We can guess that he knew every muzzle flash was making him more visible. We can guess that his hands were steady on the 76mm gun because they had been on the 76mm gun for 90 days. We can guess that at some point he made a decision, the way Leiper had made a decision, the way Clark had made a decision, the way Dunn had made a decision the night before, when he had told Berard about the engines he was hearing in the dark. He decided to stay, and while Hartmann was fighting his single-vehicle war on the ridge, something else was happening a few miles to the north. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams was 30 years old that week. He had turned 30 on the 15th of September, 4 days earlier. He was commanding the 37th Tank Battalion from a Sherman he had named Thunderbolt. This was his 4th Thunderbolt. The previous 3 had been shot out from under him in the fighting from Normandy to the Moselle. Abrams was a New England man, Massachusetts. He was short. He was stocky. He chewed unlit cigars. He spoke with a Boston accent that had softened at West Point and had come back full strength after 10 years in Army bases. He had graduated in the class of 1936. He had been an armor officer, since armor was a new idea in the American Army. He was not a flashy commander. He did not give speeches. He gave orders in short sentences. And the men under him did what he told them because they had learned that his orders worked. Abrams did not wait for orders. He heard the reports on the radio. He looked at his map. He understood what was happening. He picked up his radio microphone and he moved. A combined force from Companies A and B of the 37th Tank Battalion wheeled south, caught the German column in the flank, and destroyed 9 Panthers in a running engagement that cost 3 Shermans, 9 Panthers, 3 Shermans, in a running fight. Further west, Captain Kenneth Lamison, commanding Charlie Company of the 37th, made a decision that would define the entire day. He raced 4 Shermans 3,000 yards to a ridge just west of Bazoches-la-Petite. He put them into ambush positions with their guns already laid on the road. 3 minutes after his crews finished digging in, 8 Panthers drove directly into the killing zone. 3 minutes. That was the margin between an ambush and a meeting engagement, between American guns already aimed and German commanders still trying to figure out where the enemy was. Lamison's 4 Shermans destroyed 8 Panthers without losing a single vehicle. Ride that sentence again. 4 American medium tanks, in a war where German Panthers were supposed to be superior at every technical metric that mattered. 4 American medium tanks, destroying 8 Panthers without loss. That is not a story you tell about a war where technology decides the outcome. That is a story you tell about a war where the men matter more than the machines. This is what the Germans could not match. Not the tanks, not the guns, the system. A captain in the middle of nowhere, seeing an opportunity, moving 4 tanks 3,000 yards on his own authority, and being right. A lieutenant colonel counterattacking without waiting for orders. A lieutenant on a fog-bound ridge, repositioning his 3 surviving vehicles and telling them to hold. Nobody in the American chain of command was waiting for permission. The Germans, meanwhile, were fighting a dozen small battles in isolation. The 111th Panzer Brigade was still lost. Von Seckendorf, hours into a battle he did not yet know he was losing, still believed reinforcements were on the way from the south. They were not. And back on the fog-bound ridge, in the last Hellcat of Lieutenant Leiper's platoon, Sergeant Henry Hartmann was reloading. The morning was not yet half over. The sky above the fog was beginning to change. The fog did not burn off all at once. It thinned the way old memory thins. First the outlines of the far tree line came back. Then the shape of the road. Then a farmhouse 200 yards away that no one on the ridge had known was there. Then the shapes of the dead Panthers on the low ground, their turrets canted at wrong angles, thin smoke rising from their engine decks. By mid-morning, a man standing on Hill 246 could see almost 1,000 yards down the slope for the first time in 3 days. And that was when the Germans found out what the fog had been hiding from them. Not more Hellcats, not more Shermans. The sky. The 4th Armored Division's field artillery battalions had been on the radio net all morning. They had been listening. Forward observers working blind in the mist had been tracking the sound of engines, the location of gunfire, the pattern of the fight. They had plotted grid coordinates against what their ears could tell them. They had been ready to fire for over an hour. They had only been waiting to see. Now they could see. The 105mm howitzers of the divisional artillery opened up in a coordinated fire mission. Shells began falling on German armor. Caught in the open between Rechicourt-la-Petite and Bézange-la-Petite, Panther crews who had been trained to fight tank against tank had no doctrine for what to do when the sky itself turned hostile. That was on the 19th. 2 days later, when the ceiling finally lifted, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the 19th Tactical Air Command would finish what the howitzers had started. But that story belonged to the 21st. On the 19th, on that first day, when the fog had lifted just enough for the howitzers to work, the tally at sundown told the story. 39 German tanks lay burning or abandoned on the fields and roads around Arracourt. The 4th Armored Division had lost 4 Hellcats. The ratio was not close to even. It was not in the same universe as even. And the battle was not over. The battle did not end on the 19th. It only ended for the men who had already died. For everyone still moving, the next 10 days were a slow, grinding demonstration of what happens to a formation that has been broken but has not yet been told. On the 21st of September, the weather finally broke clean. A high-pressure system pushed across Lorraine, and the clouds pulled back. For the first time in a week, an American pilot climbing out of a strip near Nancy could see the ground below him. The 405th Fighter Group was airborne within the hour. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, painted olive drab, wings loaded with 5-inch rockets and 500-pound bombs. They found what every ground attack pilot dreams of finding: a column of enemy armor on open roads with no air cover. The Panthers of the 113th Panzer Brigade had been trained to fight tank against tank. They had no doctrine for what to do when the sky itself came down on them. Some tried to reverse into tree lines. Some tried to disperse into farm buildings. Some just stopped because the men inside could hear the engines coming and could not think of anywhere left to go. An 80mm frontal plate means nothing against a rocket that hits the engine deck from above. That was the 21st. On the 22nd of September, near a village called Lagarde, southeast of Arracourt, Colonel Erich Freiherr von Seckendorf was mortally wounded. The records do not agree on whether it was rocket, artillery, or small arms. What they agree on is where. What they agree on is when. What they agree on is that the man who had led 42 Panthers out of the assembly area at Wildflecken 18 days earlier, believing his brigade would break through to Nancy, was lying on the ground in a French field with wounds no field surgeon could close. He died the next day, the 23rd of September. He was 47 years old. The German army promoted him posthumously to general major. His body was returned to Germany. He was buried at Bad Windsheim-Obernsen in Bavaria, in the family ground, next to men whose service to their country had ended in easier centuries. Command of what was left passed to Oberstleutnant Erich Hamann. There was no longer a brigade to command. There was a Kampfgruppe, a battle group, an ad hoc gathering of what had come off the road still moving. They fought again at Hill 318. On the low ground west of Arracourt, they lost again. By the last week of September, the men in Hamann's Kampfgruppe were not fighting for Nancy anymore. They were not fighting for the Reich anymore. They were fighting because they were still inside the tanks, and the tanks were still being ordered forward, and the German army in 1944 did not have a way of stopping. That was the whole story of the war by then. Formations that had been broken but had not yet been told. On the 1st of October, 1944, the 113th Panzer Brigade ceased to exist as a formation, 27 days. That was the entire lifespan of the brigade, from the day of its activation at Wildflecken on the 4th of September to the day it was struck from the order of battle. The men still in uniform, and the vehicles still on their tracks, were absorbed into the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. They stopped being the 113th. They stopped being anything. The Germans had committed something on the order of 260 armored vehicles to the Arracourt sector across the whole battle. Panthers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, self-propelled anti-tank vehicles, half-tracks. The 4th Armored Division claimed 281 German armored vehicles destroyed in Lorraine that autumn. That number came from American records and reflects what American units reported killing. German figures for their own losses were, in the chaos of a broken front, never fully reconstructed. What is certain is that 2 brand-new Panzer brigades had been crippled as cohesive combat units, and the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel had failed to reopen the road to Nancy. The tank battles from the 19th through the 22nd had cost Combat Command, 14 Sherman medium tanks and 7 Stuart light tanks totally destroyed, 25 Americans killed, 88 wounded. For an armored engagement of that scale, against a force with numerical superiority in Panthers, those were numbers that did not belong in the same century as the fight. Back on Hill 246, on the morning of the 20th of September, Sergeant Henry R. Hartmann climbed down from his Hellcat and stood in the wet grass in his boots. His vehicle had been hit, not by anything that was supposed to kill it. It had been hit by small arms fire, machine gun rounds, and shell fragments from near misses. 13 millimeters of steel had held, not because the steel had stopped anything a Panther could throw. Because Hartmann had never stayed in one place long enough to be hit by anything the steel could not stop. He walked around the vehicle. He looked at the dents and the scars on the paint. He looked at the 6 Panthers below the hill, burned and abandoned, black smoke still curling up from what had been engines the day before. He did not say anything. There is no record of anything Hartmann said that morning to any of the other men who had survived. He climbed back up onto the deck of his Hellcat, and he sat there with his boots hanging over the side, and he lit a cigarette, and he watched the sun come up over the wet fields of Lorraine. 15 German tanks lay destroyed on the road and in the fields below the hill. Most of them were Panthers. 4 Hellcats had been engaged. 3 had been lost. Sergeant Stacy was alive. 2 other crews were still walking back through the fog on foot. Hartmann's Hellcat was the only one of the 4 still on its tracks. Now, before we close this story, understand what this fight was and what it was not. It was not the work of one man alone. The story that 6 Panthers were destroyed by a single Hellcat is true. It is documented. It is written down in the after-action report of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which any citizen of this country can read today in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The paperwork exists. The record survived the war. The story is not a legend. It is a fact. It is also the smallest possible frame around a much larger picture. Hartmann fought because Stacy had already killed 2 tanks. Stacy fought because Leiper had put his platoon on that hill. Leiper was on that hill because Dwight had brought him there. Dwight had brought him there because Clark had understood, faster than any German officer that morning, where the attack was actually going. Clark had understood it because Wilbur Berard's man, Staff Sergeant Dunn, had been listening in the dark the night before and had reported what he heard. Every single one of them had been able to act, to move, to fire, to hold, to counterattack, and every single one of them that morning the Germans had better tanks. They had a longer gun. They had heavier armor. What they did not have was a 111th Panzer Brigade that showed up on time. What they did not have was a company commander who could move 4 tanks 3,000 yards without asking permission. What they did not have was a Panther crew that had lived long enough to know each other's voices on the radio. The men who won at Arracourt were not miracles. They were the survivors of a machine that had killed everyone slower than them. That is the hard part of this story. The historian Stephen Zaloga, one of the most respected authorities on American armor of the Second World War, examined the record and reached a conclusion that sounds almost like a contradiction. The Hellcats' extraordinary combat performance, he wrote, was the product of its crews. Their training, their skill, their refusal to die in a machine that offered them nothing but speed and a gun. The design itself, he argued, was fundamentally flawed. The Army did not set out to build a machine that would select for elite crews by killing the rest. But that is what it did. And the men who built that record, most of them, never knew the final number. They knew their own fights. They knew the sound of a Panther's engine gearing down for a turn. They knew the 2 seconds of silence before you found out whether your driver was fast enough. Follow the men forward. Colonel Bruce C. Clark, who had sent Leiper's 4 Hellcats up to Hill 246, went on to command the defense of St. Vith in the Battle of the Bulge that December. 3 months after Arracourt, when the German 5th and 6th Panzer armies broke through the American line in the Ardennes and began the offensive that would come to be called the Bulge, Clark was ordered to hold the road junction town of St. Vith. He held it. For 6 days, against enormous German pressure, he held it. His stand at St. Vith slowed the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive and gave the American reinforcements time to arrive. He retired years later as a 4-star general. He said more than once that Arracourt had proved something he had always believed, that the quality of the crew mattered more than the quality of the machine. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, who had counterattacked through Rechicourt that afternoon in his 4th Thunderbolt, went on to lead the spearhead that broke through to Bastogne that December, relieving the encircled 101st Airborne Division in what Patton called the finest feat of arms in the war. He would go through 7 Thunderbolts before the war ended. He rose after the war to become Chief of Staff of the United States Army during Vietnam. He was the officer who oversaw the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia. He died in office in 1974 of complications from lung cancer, still wearing the uniform he had first put on at West Point almost 40 years earlier. When the Army designed the tank that would replace the Sherman's descendants in the 1980s, they named it after him, the M18 Abrams. The main battle tank of the United States Army today still carries his name. If you served in a tread unit at any point in the last 40 years, you rode on top of Creighton Abrams's name. And then there was Major General John S. Wood. Wood had built the 4th Armored Division. He had trained it stateside. He had shipped it to England. He had brought it ashore in Normandy in July. He had driven it 400 miles across France in 5 weeks. Everything the division was, its speed, its aggressiveness, its willingness to run ahead of its own supply lines, was the direct product of the man who had shaped it from the spring of 1942 onward. He was called P. Wood. It stood for professor. He had earned the nickname at West Point, tutoring classmates who were struggling with math and engineering. He had graduated in the class of 1912. He had been in the Army for 32 years by the autumn of Arracourt. He believed deeply in the same doctrine that had won on Hill 246. He believed a commander's job was to point his subordinates at the enemy and then get out of their way. On the 3rd of December, 1944, 75 days after Arracourt, John S. Wood was relieved of his command. The Corps commander over him was Major General Manton S. Eddy of the 12th Corps. The two men had been disagreeing for weeks over how the 4th Armored should be employed. Eddie wanted a division that did what it was told. Wood wanted a division that ran forward and made the enemy react. Eddie won that argument by pulling rank. Wood never held a combat command again. He had built one of the finest divisions in the American Army. He had watched it fight the battle at Arracourt that would still be studied at Fort Benning 80 years later. And he was sent home before it crossed the Rhine. The men who had loved him under his command wrote letters after the war. They tried to explain what the division had been under Wood. Most of the letters ended in the same place. They ended with the observation that he had been the kind of commander who trusted his men, which was the same thing that had won at Arracourt, and the same thing that had cost him his job. Sergeant Henry R. Hartman, Sergeant Stacy, First Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, Captain William A. Dwight, Captain Thomas J. Evans, First Lieutenant Wilbur J. Berard, Staff Sergeant Timothy J. Dunn. These men appear in the after-action reports of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion and the 37th Tank Battalion. Their personal papers, if they wrote any, are scattered across attics and county archives in the country they came home to. Most of them did not become famous. Most of them did not need to. They had already done the thing that mattered on a wet ridge in Lorraine on a foggy Tuesday morning. They came home. They took off the uniform. They took jobs. They married girls. They had children. They mowed lawns. They went to Little League games. They put the war away in a drawer and closed the drawer and did not talk about what they had done in it. That was the generation. That was what they did. They believed that the doing of the thing had been the point, not the telling of it afterward. The stories survive because a few of them, in a few interviews, in a few letters to their grown children, in a few notes at the bottom of a Christmas card, said something. And because paperwork, once filed, does not disappear. The paperwork of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion is still there. Anyone can read it. It says what happened on Hill 246 on the 19th of September, 1944. It says the names. It says the numbers. It says who fired and who was hit and who lived and who did not. That is the record. That is the truth. And then, less than 2 years after Arracourt, the United States Army did something that says almost everything about how quickly institutional memory can be overwritten. On the 10th of November 1946, the Tank Destroyer Force was abolished. The whole doctrine, the whole idea. Brigadier General Andrew D. Bruce's vision of a fast, lightly armored hunter that killed tanks with speed and gun rather than steel. The doctrine that Hartman and Stacy and Leiper had proved on Hill 246, retired. The peacetime army had looked at the record and decided that the tank destroyer was not needed. In an age of heavier main battle tanks and better anti-tank weapons for the infantry, the whole concept of a specialized tank hunter had become, in the view of the post-war reformers, obsolete. The generals who had championed the tank destroyer force, including Andrew Bruce himself, had moved on to other assignments. The men who had fought in the Purple Heart boxes had gone home. There was nobody left to argue the case. The M18 Hellcat, the vehicle Stephen Zaloga would later document as having the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank destroyer of the Second World War, was declared surplus. Hundreds of them were sold or given away to nationalist China, to Yugoslavia, to Iran, to Venezuela, to armies in countries most of the men who had crewed them in Lorraine had never heard of. Some of those Hellcats would still be in service in foreign hands 40 years later. There are photographs from the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s that show M18s on Iranian tank transporters, still moving, still fighting, still being used exactly the way General Bruce had intended in 1941, fast, lightly armored. Hunting the Purple Heart box outlived the doctrine that built it. The Germans mocked the Hellcat because they measured it the way they measured everything. By the thickness of its armor and the caliber of its gun, by those metrics, the M18 was a toy. By those metrics, they were right. But the metrics were wrong, because the Hellcat was never designed to survive by standing still and absorbing punishment. It was designed to survive by being somewhere else before the punishment arrived, and the men who crewed it, the men who fought with no roof over their heads and a 2-second margin between life and death every time they pulled the trigger, those men did not need 80 millimeters of steel to protect them. They had speed, they had nerve, they had each other. And in the fog of Lorraine, on a low ridge above a stone village called Rechicourt-la-Petite, when every advantage that the Panther was supposed to have vanished at a range of 30 feet, all that was left in the balance was 90 days of shared combat on the American side of the scale, and 2 weeks of hurried training on the German side, 90 days against 2 weeks. That was the whole battle. That is what won it. There are still men alive today whose fathers were in the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion. Some of them know the story. Some of them do not. Some of them have found the after-action reports in the National Archives and read the paragraphs about Hill 246 and wept quietly at desks in reading rooms in College Park, Maryland, decades after the fact. Some of them have grandchildren who know that Grandpa was in the war, but do not know what he did in it, because Grandpa did not talk about it, because that was the generation. The generation is almost gone now. The men who crewed the Purple Heart boxes in France in the autumn of 1944 are, in the year in which this is being told, mostly dead. The youngest of them would be past 100. Most did not make it that far. They came home. They lived their lives. They put the drawer closed. They died in nursing homes and hospital beds and in their own houses of old, ordinary American causes. They did not die in flames on a foggy ridge in France. They died in their beds, decades later, having lived the lives that Hartman's shooting and Stacy's shooting and Leiper's holding of the ridge had bought for them. That is what victory looked like, not in the moment, in the 60 years after. The story that the tank destroyer force was a failed idea is one that historians will argue about for as long as there are historians. Zaloga is right that the design of the Hellcat was flawed, that the doctrine was flawed, that the whole enterprise required elite crews to compensate for what the machine could not do on its own. But something happened on Hill 246 that morning that the flawed design and the flawed doctrine did not predict. Something happened that had nothing to do with tungsten or armor thickness or muzzle velocity. Something happened between men, 90 days, 2 weeks, fog a colonel who trusted a captain who trusted a lieutenant who trusted a sergeant named Henry R. Hartman who, when 3 of the 4 vehicles in his platoon were gone, decided he was going to stay. That decision does not appear in any chart. It does not appear in any technical manual. It does not appear in any post-war analysis of the tank destroyer force. It appears only in the after-action report of the 704th, in the dry language of a battalion clerk noting that Sergeant Hartman had destroyed 6 enemy vehicles. 6. That is the number that survived. That is the number that outlived the doctrine, the vehicle, the war, the man himself, the German army he defeated, and the peace that came afterward. 6 Panthers on the wet ground below a low ridge in France on a Tuesday morning in September, the Purple Heart box. Built for men nobody envied, in a factory nobody remembers, run by men whose names live now only in after-action reports and in the memories of families that are themselves passing. 6 kills, 1 survivor, 90 days of shared combat against 2 weeks of hurried training. That was Arracourt. That is what won it. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it moved you, a like helps these men be remembered. It tells the algorithm that real history, American history, still matters. It helps this story reach someone whose father or grandfather or uncle might have ridden in one of these vehicles and never talked about it when he came home. If you are not subscribed yet, I would be honored if you joined us. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss another story like this one. And I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, in an armored unit, in a Hellcat, in a Sherman, in a Stuart, in anything at all, tell me about them in the comments. These stories survive because people like you keep them alive. Thank you.